Few moments. We're grateful that you're here this morning. We are grateful, the Danleys are grateful to be back after being away Wednesday night to be with my family for Thanksgiving. Freddie and I are trying to keep you guessing on who's going to be preaching or teaching for a while. So I don't know if he announced on Wednesday night or not that he was going to be out at New Harmony this morning, filling in out there. So I've been accused lately of not preaching enough around here. I won't say who it was, just a couple ladies on the back row that accused me of not speaking enough. I wouldn't call their names. They just rhyme with Ferry and Bonita. Said they're not even paying attention to me. So that said I've been gone too much, but they were just picking at me. But it's that time of year where we all have a lot going on, and it's a busy time, but we are thankful for the chance to be together. It's funny how, of course, most of you here are fully aware of this, but how a service and being together here at this building in particular sort of grounds us and allows us to know, what day it is kind of thing. We were laughing over the weekend and Friday and Saturday and all that we didn't know what day it was. Certainly this time of year, if there's football on, it feels like it's Saturday, but there's football on all Thanksgiving weekend, so you don't know if it's Friday or Saturday or what day it is. And even during a gospel meeting, it kind of works in reverse, right? Every night feels like a Wednesday night when we're here for service, but it's something to say and something to think about how when we're here together and we have a chance to study, that it does sort of center us, it sort of grounds us and gives us a chance to think about some encouraging things, and especially as we go back out into the busyness of life and the world around us. Maybe you're like me and your family. My family, we love the holiday season overall, from Thanksgiving into Christmas time and the chance to be together with family, but we're also grateful for this opportunity and look forward to studying together today. As you can see on the screen here, we're going to be in Luke 19, verses 1 through 10, and we're going to talk about Zacchaeus. I know sometimes you all get a little further off than the classes, and not everybody, even in this class or in this material, knows exactly where we are, but we are in the midst of the Apologetics Press material that we've been covering, and we're covering in here because our younger classes are covering it as well, kind of back to the days of Engraving Heavenly Truths that we're all studying something similar. The Apologetics Press material we're using is broken down typically into halves, which you can't break 13 into half, but you get the idea of either 6 lessons or 7 lessons over one topic, and then vice versa for the back half of that particular quarter. And so we talked about miracles, I think it was the first half of this quarter, but now as we've turned the page, the last section for this first year is entitled Jesus the Master Teacher. Jesus the Master Teacher. And so we've talked about a few things already, but we are ready for lesson 9 in this material, which is called Zacchaeus. I have a question for you to begin, and it's going to come back, so I'm going to give you some time to think about it. I know sometimes when you're called on, it's hard to answer just right off the top of your head. I'm going to give you the answer. I'm going to give you the question and give you a little bit of time to think about it while we're going through the lesson, and then we'll come back to it. But the question this morning is, if I can get this thing to work, it's thinking, what's an adult lesson from this kid's story? So again, you don't have to answer now. Even if you think of something, write it down so you don't forget it. But I ask it that way on purpose, of course. A couple of years ago, I spoke at Dayton and in a summer series, and their summer series was sort of I don't remember exactly, but not just a kid's story. Right, not just a kid's story. So we make Daniel and the Lion's Den to be a great story and a kid's story that we don't always preach on or talk about, but we teach it to our kids. And one of the first things we sometimes point out is the fact that, Daniel is often portrayed in pictures and drawings as a 13-year-old, a kid in amongst these lions, when in reality he may have been in his 80s, or certainly an older man in the lion's den. And so that would be one. You've heard me talk about before in sermons and in lessons, the ark, right, and the flood. The ark exhibit, if you've been able to go to the ark encounter, is what it's called in Kentucky, put on by Answers in Genesis there, and visited the ark and toured the ark. They have a whole room that emphasizes the fact that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of children's books with bright, happy animals and rainbows, which is a part of the story, that make it seem like this wonderful, happy thing that, is great. But when you really look at it, and the world's population essentially perishes in the flood, then it's not exactly a fun-filled, comforting story. Now, there's certainly good things there, but it's not just a children's story. I don't know that we would call Zacchaeus a kid's story or a children's story, but there's a good chance, and I'll raise my hand here, that I've not preached on it in a while, that you may not have heard a sermon on it in a while, to adults. So are there even any adult lessons that we can take from this kid's story? Now, again, if you think of something, write it down so you don't forget it. But we'll come back to this in the end, and maybe you'll think of something as we go through. But I wanted to set you up. I wanted to have you a chance to think about it. And we'll try to go through this story and think about what we know about Zacchaeus, and maybe again how it applies to us, because this material is aimed at young people. I mean, it's in this story. This is what Freddie uses and our teachers use is aimed at sometimes kindergarten, first, second grade. So that's what's being taught. But what about us here in the auditorium class or even the class downstairs? I know this is going to be really small and hard for you to see. I never can remember which button I'm looking for here. Is it this one? Yeah. But this, you guys know I'm a map guy now, right? I have one almost every week. But this is our same map that we've been using for a long time. Here's the Sea of Galilee, or the same area, I guess, different map. Sea of Galilee, so here's Capernaum. And if you've been in my class, as we've talked about the 12 apostles, Capernaum and Bethsaida, Peter, Andrew, James, and John would have been from up here. Here's the Jordan River that comes all the way down to the Dead Sea. And so we've talked recently about Samaria. So here's Nazareth. Jesus is of Galilee and Nazareth here. And then the most important thing as we think about is Jerusalem down here. We talked about having to pass through Samaria. So the reason I pulled this map, and again, I know maybe you can make out this darkened line, if you can see my pointer there, that kind of goes right through here and then comes around. This is describing Jesus' last trip into Jerusalem. So this is what we've talked about. Up here, it says that Jesus resolutely sets out for Jerusalem, Luke chapter 9. He decides that he's going to Jerusalem. This is going to be the last time he's making this trip before his death. The reason I found this map interesting is right here it says Jesus attempts to pass through Samaria and he encounters opposition right here, and this is Samaria. So then they go around. Well, I drew this right by hand. If you've been in my class, we drew this the other day, and we said that he would go around Samaria. This is when James and John, the sons of thunder, want to call down fire from heaven on the Samaritans because they rejected Jesus. And so this is this trip. He comes around. Now, the other thing that's interesting about here is this is the Old Testament section, right? Because here's the Jordan River, and here's Jericho. And so as we think about what takes place in not Exodus, but much later as the children of Israel are going to cross at the beginning of the book of Joshua, and then they're going to take over Jericho, this is the territory that we're in. And so right here, this box above the word Judea says, Jesus passes through Jericho, heals 2 blind men, and meets Zacchaeus. So this is the map I was looking for. I know it's kind of hard for you to see, but this is it. Here's Jericho. He set his face to go just a little further west here towards Jerusalem, but that is where we are. This is the section. This is the timeline. This is the map that he is passing through as he has come around Samaria now. We mentioned that with James and John, and now he is ready to enter this. So let's talk about what we know about Zacchaeus, right? He was a wee little man. That's what anybody knows. If you heard it from your childhood with the song that we sing, then this is the one that a lot of people think of first and foremost. He was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. Of course, it would be hard to know exactly. The Apologetics Press material that they put out for our kids here, usually tries to weave in what's known from history. They actually have a quote here that says, according to the Bible background commentary, I don't think I have that in my library, but Bible background commentary, Zacchaeus was probably less than 5 feet tall. Less than 5 feet tall. Since he was short and called short, but short also by ancient Mediterranean standards. All right, so what do we know about history? All those things. I'm not here to break all that down, but when we think about history and what we know about people during that time, he was short. Now, I don't know if he was this short, right? Some of you remember Manute Bowl, the tall guy on the right, and some of you remember little Spud Webb on the left-hand side there, maybe at one time the tallest and the shortest players in the NBA. So I don't know if he looked like that standing next to Jesus, but he was a wee little man, right? He was a short fella. And I mean, I don't know about you, but under 5 feet tall, that's pretty short. I mean, that would rival most of our kids. Like Laney's got his class over here, and Tinley's in there, and Campbell, and I think Molly's in there, and Hannah's class is back here. She's got the next age down. There's probably none. But I mean, that's pretty short to think about being under 5 feet tall. And so we don't know for sure, but that certainly seems like, we're told that. He was a short person, short man, and then the tree gets involved. We'll get there in just a second. But that is one thing we know for sure. And as we've talked about in our apostles class, we're trying to understand and ascertain what we can know for sure, and then, weaving history in a little bit and kind of get at least an idea of the picture here. Number 2, he was a rich man. Did you know that it says that at the end of verse number 1 there? It says that he was rich. He was rich. And so what that means exactly, I don't know. We have talked about this probably before at Vacation Bible School or in other classes, and how this, maybe upper class, as we think about a class system, might have lived, the things that they might have had. He was a chief tax collector. It says right before that. So that's important because those two things go together. Now, you are probably familiar with the fact that the tax collectors were known for taking more than they were supposed to and then pocketing that, right? So if you owed me $100, if I was a tax collector and you owed me $100 in taxes, I would say, well, you actually owe me $125, right? And I would pocket the $25. Now, here's the key. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but he was, what the scripture says there, a chief tax collector. So he was not just the tax collector, but there's almost this system of tax collectors. I'm trying to think. I was listening to a lesson that a brother had done at PTP about Zacchaeus. And by the way, that was kind of the same thing. It was more than a kid's story. It was kind of the theme of that as well, like Dayton had done with their summer series. But he said the idea here is that he was the director of the collectors, right? So he's even a step above. So y'all remember a few weeks ago, or maybe a month or two ago now, I preached a couple of lessons and I called them the first, right? Or I called it the world's worst grandmother on Sunday morning. And then on Sunday night, we called it the world's first panic room. And we talked about those passages from the Old Testament. I couldn't help but think here, if this is not the world's first pyramid scheme. Is that what this was at this time? Now, they're not getting investors necessarily. If you know about a pyramid scheme and how that works, I mean, there's some true dishonesty there as far as maybe even a shell game of moving money. They keep borrowing from money that comes in, even though there's money and they spend it, and there's not money even there. So maybe a little bit of difference. But when we go back to this idea, let me go backwards one here, that he was the chief tax collector. My illustration a minute ago was if you owe me $100 in taxes and I say you owe me $125, with Zacchaeus, I'm not pocketing $125 or $25. I may be pocketing $10, and I've got to give Zacchaeus $15. And so he was certainly probably rich in that maybe he's collecting some of his own, but as the director of the collectors, he's also skimming some more from those regular tax collectors who would go around doing the work there. I couldn't help but think, going back to our map just a minute ago, about Samaria. And I know Freddie talked about this, I think it was last Sunday morning, with the Samaritans and what we know. And we sometimes talk about the Jews and the Samaritans. And I even used this as an illustration a couple of weeks ago on Wednesday night. But that, Jesus talking about the Samaritans, using the Good Samaritan as elevating that character in a parable there would be something that was, that's the worst of the worst. But the truth is maybe the chief tax collector is the worst of the worst, right? Now, this is not a parable. It's not something that's made up, but it is a pretty interesting thing to think about, the fact that when you think about the Romans and you think about the Jews and you think about the government, you think about tax collectors, this was not a fun thing to think about. And so I think we'll have more on that in just a moment. This is not much of a spoiler alert because you've already heard this story before. But when you think about what you know about Zacchaeus and his story, we do want to go ahead and throw in here, for the purpose of our time, that he had a benevolent heart. Now, maybe that was tucked away. We're in that season of Christmas and people are watching the Grinch movie and talking about the Grinch, right? And we talk about his little heart, and the heart grew, or that kind of thing. I mean, maybe he had a heart that was tucked away inside, and he could be benevolent, but he just didn't usually act that way, and kind of covered it up, maybe with greed. I mean, I don't know exactly, but that benevolent heart comes back. When we think about what he says there in verse number 8, it says that he stood and he said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I've taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold." Now, we're not going to take the time here to go through all the Old Testament passages and all the details. But in Exodus, if you're making notes, you want to jot it down. Exodus chapter 22, verses 1 through 4. In Exodus 22, under the Mosaical law, as we think about the law of Moses, that they were still living under at this time, a Jew was required to make restitution when he could. All right? So he was required to make restitution when he could. We don't even necessarily think about it from a Mosaical perspective, but we try to do the same thing most of the time. I mean, if an accident happens or something occurs, a lot of times we'll try to say, well, within reason, which of course that can be debatable sometimes between people and parties, and depending on what the accident was or whatever. But within reason, we're willing to make restitution for something. Of course, the problem here, or part of the side issue of this, is that the Pharisees developed their own tradition and rules. As we think about this time, and Jesus is preaching and teaching, and he's struggling with these Pharisees and the Sadducees, these Jewish leaders. One thing he's struggling with is not just their adherence to the law, but their traditions and their rules that they came up with. According to the Pharisaical rules, they required a Jew to pay back or make up for 4 or 5 times what the original item was worth, but only for stolen oxen and sheep, and only in certain circumstances. Now, without going into all those details, simply suffice it to say, what does that sound like? It sounds like what we always know about the Pharisees, right? I mean, we'll create this thing, but then there's all these stipulations that you have to hold to. The one we commonly point out, of course, is the washing of hands they talk about, right? Not necessarily for cleanliness, but that you do it the number of times that we say you have to do it. And there's kind of branches off of all of these things. And so Zacchaeus' offer to return everything plus extra truly went beyond both the law, the Mosaical law, and the traditions of the Pharisees, as we think about here. And so he shows this benevolent heart. Now, I'm kind of hinting a little bit already at maybe a couple of lessons that we can learn, right? The adult lessons we can learn from this kid's story. So we'll kind of put a pin in that right now and maybe come back to it towards the end as we ask you to give us some suggestions on some things we can learn. But that's what we know about Zacchaeus. Now, let's kind of continue working our way through the story here and think about some other things that are taking place. Number one, I think about this idea. Notice in verse number 2, and he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd. Now, that's my own word in parentheses there, of course, paparazzi, but you may have heard me use this as an illustration before, but it's just kind of the best thing I can come up with. I know the world's different today, and there's cell phones everywhere and all kinds of people that take pictures of people's houses or those kinds of things. But before social media and before the internet even really, when I was a kid, and certainly some of you remember when you were younger and all, and there were the tabloid magazines, and those kinds of things, or the news shows that were on. But a person couldn't get from their car to the restaurant, or an athlete or a star, a Hollywood star, actress or actor, because of the paparazzi and this crowd that's pushing in on them. And those things still do occur. But that's just always what sticks out in my mind. You don't have to answer, but what do you think of as you read that idea there, because of the crowd? Now, I don't know, I didn't take the time to write down each one, but go back to chapter 18 for just a moment. And notice there in chapter 18 and verse 18, chapter 18 and verse 35, then it happened as he was coming near Jericho that a certain blind man sat by the road begging, verse 36, and hearing a multitude passing. Right? So what did that sound like? Here's somebody who can't see who hears the multitude passing. And I mean, when you think about that, then if you're still there, go to the end of chapter 18, verse 43. Immediately he received his sight and followed him, adding to the crowd. And so, I mean, this must have been something to behold. We know from different occasions that Jesus was always struggling with this, right? He would go off on his own sometimes. One of my favorite stories growing up was from Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12 is the occasion where the young man is let down through the roof. I don't know why that was my favorite, but it was just one of my favorite stories as a kid. But having to be let down because you can't get into the building. You can't get into the house. And so, I mean, it's part of the story here because Zacchaeus is short and he has to climb this tree. But I mean, what that might have been like as he is continuing to travel and to pass through, and it almost seems like it's growing, like this blob, this mass of people that just keeps growing and growing. And I get tired just thinking about it, right? I mean, I get wearisome just thinking about, some days, and some of you have been in jobs like that. I know Tammy, when she was a vice principal and they're working at the school, I mean, it's just like person after person, and everywhere you go, people are talking to you, and there's just something, you come home and you're just exhausted, from dealing with people. Well, can you imagine if that is a crowd that's thronging around you, and I mean, beyond even just a school setting and helping people in that way, but I mean, he's literally healing people. I mean, what would you do if you were in the crowd? Kind of back to Mark chapter 2 and those guys trying to get this young man into the room through the roof. What if it was your kid and there's 500 people, 1,000 people? I don't know. I mean, it'd be hard for 1,000 people to kind of keep moving together. But certainly this blind man in chapter 18 hears the multitude and asks what it means. So it's just kind of something to think about here, I think, with Zacchaeus, that not only could he not see, verse 3, but verse 4, he ran ahead. How much effort did that take? How far did he have to go? And he climbed up into the sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. Number 2, here, just some things to consider. Taxes, right? When we think about taxes, we've already touched on this just a little bit, but it's unfortunate, I mean, that this role that he had as not only just a tax collector, but a chief tax collector, and this was, not going to be fun. Now it's funny as I was looking through this material again to think about, Hannah and even Laney and some of them trying to explain taxes to the kids, today and trying to explain how taxes work. Maybe we should have seen how that would go. But, you understand in this room how that would have not been something that's good, how we often feel like we're being cheated, or, however you feel about taxes or how much taxes we should pay, or that kind of thing. This was very difficult. And kind of back to, as we alluded to a moment ago, the worst of the worst. And it's going to come out because as you remember there in verse 7, when they, who's they? Well, they would have been some of these others, some of these groups of people, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, those who were trying to trap Jesus, maybe even others. I mean, Zacchaeus was probably not on the top of the list at Thanksgiving dinner, right, to be invited. Maybe not even by his own family, who knows? But a chief tax collector, they saw it. They all complained, and this is the New King James again, but they grumbled, whatever it might be. He has gone to be a guest with a man who is a sinner. I wonder what that sounded like. I don't know if that's because they believed as Jesus did that this is a sin and he's stealing, or if they just didn't like him. And if you don't like him, you call him a sinner, whether you actually know whether what he's doing or not is a sin. I'll tell you that again from this material, when it's presented to the teachers and then to the kids, and you think about lessons, there's memory work each week. I don't know how many of them are doing that exactly in their classes, but for the younger children, there's kind of two groups. It's broken into two categories. For the younger children, the memory work is Exodus 20 and verse 15, you shall not steal, right? So when we talk about lessons, you shall not steal. And for the older children, it's Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28, let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor working with his hands what is good. We don't like taxes. We don't like having to pay, even though there's another whole lesson here about what Jesus said about those things, rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. The fact that Paul talks about in the book of Romans, we are to obey the government. The government is set up by God to be a ruling entity. Now, we still want them to do what God would have them to do and lead in a godly way, which may not be and is often, sadly, not what's happening when people get in power positions. But it plays a part here. Because while this is not a parable, and remember I mentioned a moment ago that Jesus could maybe handpick a particular group when he's telling a parable or using a story of some sort, this seems to be a real life account here, a real person, but still it is someone who is less than desirable to everyone as we think about this idea of taxes. When this story moves on, look in verse number 5 there. It says, and when Jesus came to the place, I assume the place being there, the tree that he had climbed up to, whether Jesus could see him or not, he looked up and saw him. And all I could think of is several writers pointed out, some of you may remember there's an old sketch where, the guys would look and they'd say, you, me, you, me, you. Zacchaeus is looking for Jesus. But that's not what happens because Jesus finds Zacchaeus. And not only that, there in verse 5, he calls him by his name, Zacchaeus. We've talked about this in our class on Wednesday nights with Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Were they ever offended by what Jesus called them? The book that I've been using has kind of played on that. We don't necessarily have that sense from Scripture, but we talked about, especially with Peter, if he heard one name or the other, that he was disappointed because, calling somebody by a nickname they don't like or something like that. But, what is Zacchaeus here in this moment? Did he almost fall out of the tree because he was surprised? We don't necessarily get a sense of how much he knew exactly. Look again in verse 3, and he sought to see who Jesus was. Some indicate in their writings that he obviously had to have known who Jesus was and what he could do, and so that's why he's making such great effort. Maybe he knew a little bit, he didn't know fully. Either way, he makes the effort to get in the tree, to get ahead and get in the tree. And then when Jesus shows up, it's not hey, Jesus, look up here. Jesus shows up. Without Jesus calling his name and calling him out, might he have been content to stay right there, watch the crowd pass by, and then, come down and go on his way? I don't know. Doesn't really matter because what happens is what we read here, that Jesus says, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And so verse 6 says, and he made haste, came down, and he did receive him joyfully. Can you imagine being the one called out by Jesus? Again, not in a bad way, but in a good way. We have all these instances where things are occurring through the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where Jesus is moving or something is happening, and then he recognizes someone. And by recognize, I mean he calls them out. He points them out. And so that must have been a wonderful thing. Certainly from a human perspective, we might elevate that as a self-glorification thing, right? I mean, yes, you think about the children that he gathered, right? Several times maybe when he calls the children, brings the children, would you be the parent in the back going, yes, he called my child up. I mean, not because for some reason other than, look, he got my child. I'm kind of excited. It's a little bit of a selfish thing, but natural human emotion maybe. So how does Zacchaeus feel here? I don't know, but Jesus called his name. Well, in the moment, I don't know how he felt. We do know how he felt afterwards because he comes down and receives him joyfully. And then, of course, we've already mentioned it from verse number 7, but the group who are around, I mean, you're never happy. They are never happy with Jesus. Now, we do read on multiple occasions that they are trying to trap him, right? They are trying to catch him. In fact, that's the whole setting or the base setting for the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Is that a certain lawyer is trying to catch him in these things. They're trying to ask him questions, but you are never happy. Now, the interesting thing here is we can take this a step further. Go back to Luke chapter 18. Just one page maybe in your Bible. Luke chapter 18 again, and we referenced it very quickly, but in verses 35 through the end of the chapter in verse 43, he meets a blind man, we might say a blind poor man. It does mention there that he is begging. We know from history's sake that this is, someone who would have been in that position, would have been in a very difficult position. They would have been kind of on their own sometimes, or need someone to help them. What's interesting, though, is this fact that here in Luke chapter 18, he meets at least one beggar. Now, I don't want to spend too much time going into this because of it's just not worth our time. But the same thing happens, and if you want to notice this real quick, Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20. And what I'll say is I'll try to give you a brief overview, and then I can point you towards an article. One of the great things that this material does, especially for the older kids, if the teachers use it, or for you all, and we can use it, is gives references to other articles from the Apologetics Press catalog, from their material. And so here's a textual criticism. I keep feeling like I'm setting you up for the class that we're going to try to get to in January, which will be here before we know it. But talking about how we got the Bible, and related to that sometimes is what we call textual criticism, what you do with maybe problems in the text, so-called problems or so-called contradictions. This is one of them, all right? Matthew chapter 20, notice there, beginning in verse number 30, that it says, now as they went, here's the first problem, so-called problem, out of Jericho. Now, I don't know if you held your place there, if you used your finger or whatever, but in Luke chapter 18 and verse 35, it says, it happened as he came near Jericho. Okay, out of or into. And then notice in Matthew chapter 20 and verse 29 there, and behold, two blind men sitting by the road, when they heard that Jesus was passing by. All right? Now, in Luke's account, it says there was just one. So this is kind of a question here. This is something that people would say, wait a minute, what's occurring? And we are talking about the same time frame. Now, that is something that's going to take a little bit of thinking or a little bit of looking into these things as you think about it here. Sorry, I was trying to look through Matthew and through my headings and find... Well, as you just think about, what's occurring here, that these things are, the triumphal entry is around this time. If you look at Matthew's account and you look at Luke's account, the triumphal entry, and now I showed you that map because this is Jesus' last trip into Jerusalem, and so his last week is about to start. Now, the article is by our brother Eric Lyons, and it goes into a little more detail, again, than we have time to, but there's some multiple things here. Number one, about writing, how you write something. If you say Joel has a son, is that a false statement? No, but are you telling everything? Well, no, Joel has 4 children, not just a son. But if you reference Joel's one son, you're saying something that's true. Just because Luke calls out that there is one beggar doesn't necessarily mean there might not have been 2. The other interesting thing here is that when you look at the history in the city of Jericho, this is where the article gets a little more detailed. It's not really that long, but when you get into the article, it was in the material here. Of course, I did not link it, but it's called, I'm not going to be able to find it now in my notes here. I was just trying to think of what the article was called, but it had to do with the city of Jericho, and I'll be able to find that if you're interested in it and give it to you. But there were 2 Jerichos, right? There was the original Jericho that we kind of pointed out on the map that the children of Israel and Joshua laid flat. Remember the marching, all those things, trumpets, right? The city of Jericho laid flat. And then there was what was called a Herodian Jericho. And so it's possible that they're leaving one and entering the other and exiting the other. There's some things that are possible there. My point is, we sometimes fear these things that maybe don't line up perfectly when it's not something to be feared. It takes a little bit of study of what's called textual criticism and understanding argumentation and those kinds of things, and why when somebody says, well, here's a contradiction, how you kind of think about it. Now, look, I also understand most of you, we're not worried about that. Nobody's going to call you out on Facebook and say, well, wait a minute, what about Luke chapter 18 and Matthew chapter 20? I understand. But I think it can be faith-building and hopefully encouraging to think about for these things, and that we don't have to fear just because we come across something that we have a question about, that must mean the Bible's not true and faith has to crumble. So the truth is here, there are those who are around who are never happy. And the reason I mention that is because in Luke 18, what happens? Jesus is dealing with 2 beggars. or one or two beggars there. And it says that the crowd is not happy with this, right? And especially in Matthew chapter 20. Look at verse 39 in Luke 18. Those who went before warned him that he should be quiet. And then, so Jesus dealing with a beggar, two beggars on this hand, not even turn the page, and he's dealing with a rich publican. He's dealing with both kinds, and they're never going to be happy when they're dealing with Jesus. They're just always frustrated because they are trying to attempt to catch him, and they simply can't in what's going on. But man, that must have been as tiring in some cases as anything, you know. Here he meets two beggars, then he's going to meet a rich publican, and I mean, it's just, they are never happy with what he's doing. He's constantly having to deal with those things. And it's just kind of something, doesn't necessarily deal with Zacchaeus exactly, other than the fact that it comes up in this, in the text. Verse 7 in particular, they saw it and they all grumbled or complained. Now, one more thing real quick, and I'm about to get back to our question. Let's see if that was the next one. Yeah, I'll leave that up there, and you can be thinking about it. We'll take some of your suggestions here. But one more thing real quick. Tucked away here at the very end of Luke 19 is verse number 10, or at the end of Luke's account of Zacchaeus here. Let's go back to verse 9 and grab it all. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost." There's an important note here about faith. You know, and what faith is and how it takes faith to be pleasing to God. Hebrews chapter 11, it takes faith to be pleasing. And Zacchaeus had a level of faith here. But also when we think about Jesus' purpose and our purpose, this is the passage we come to. He came to seek and to save that which was lost. And that's exactly what we should be doing. Yes, Miss Nancy, you raise your hand?
Can I ask two quick questions?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm a little confused on something. You might straighten me
Yeah.
Is there two Zacchaeuses in the Bible? Is there two of them in the Bible?
Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head.
And another one later?
Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head.
Is there two Lazarus?
Yeah, I think there could be two Lazarus. Now, here's the other thing about that is that I know as we've talked about the 12 apostles on Wednesday night, I mean, certainly there are popular names, you know, least popular names. I don't know that anybody was publishing the most popular baby names of.
I did a devotional this morning, and I think it was Peter, but it's talked about Lazarus.
Mm-hmm.
On your map, you have a map that shows Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
Did you hear that question?
Yes. Or no, sorry, I didn't hear the question. I heard the part of it. What were you saying? One more time.
Do you have a map that shows Turkey?
I'm sure I can find one. I don't know that I have one in this presentation, but I can find one. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah. Sure. We can do that. And we can talk about those names too, just for the sake of time offline a little bit. But yeah, we could talk about that. Because I know when you talk about Lazarus, that may be a name that you'll find a couple places. And I know Freddie talked a little bit Wednesday night about the name Philip, right? We've talked about when we see some of these names, even James. I didn't get into that in my class, if you were here, by the way. But James and John, you know, whether it's James, the brother of John, or James, the half-brother of Jesus. So we've tried to, that's something else that's a good study. I appreciate your question to mention those things. So I don't care to get with you afterwards or in the next few days and talk about those things, and we can look at some maps because it can be encouraging, helpful to think about those things, for sure. Sure, yeah. When we think about trying to, and that's back to the thing of Jericho there, you know. I mean, what is modern day Turkey or modern day, you know, Iran or Iraq as we think about that part of the world.
More sense when you can visualize.
Sure. That's why I use those. And I appreciate your question. Yeah, absolutely. So real quick, let's get to this. We're going to run out of time. And I appreciate those questions. We can try to get back to them. And even if it's something that you want to know, we can bring it up again in another class. Miss Nancy and I can talk about it certainly, but we can let others know what we discuss and find out if you have interest in those things. So absolutely. I obviously have several things written down. I had the privilege of knowing what's coming. Anything come to your mind about any adult lessons that you think you can learn from this story? Okay. Sure. A good point. Sorry. Tammy says perseverance. I mean, he had to work. There's several of these that kind of overlap a little bit. I think it overlaps with the one I have. We can get to in a minute, but the perseverance that it takes, the effort that it takes some people, to find Jesus, just in a broad sense. Think about somebody today. We sometimes talk about the bushman in Africa, right? What about those bush people in Africa? Well, yeah, I mean, they're further away from modern United States of America, where the Bible is, maybe the greatest selling book year after year or whatever. It's going to be harder to find Jesus. Someone in Russia, or certainly places like the Far East, where the government shuts those things down. Johnny Holman stood here, last Sunday night and told us about how difficult it can be when the government says you can't have a Bible to learn about Jesus. So perseverance is absolutely true. Anything else here? Do not make me sing, Miss Nancy. I'm not singing that song. I'm going to send you to Hannah's class. That's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to talk. This material usually has several songs listed to teach the kids. And, of course, that one was in there, the one we all know from Zacchaeus. But there were a few others. I want to talk about one in just a moment and some of the things that I had. What else? Yeah, Miss. Okay. Sure. Even those who are rich still need Jesus. Absolutely. Yeah, kind of back to what Tammy said. She said he didn't let his circumstances hinder him from his goal. So kind of like Tammy was saying, the perseverance to keep going. Yep.
And he wanted to see who Jesus was for himself.
Good one, Miss Sue. He wanted to see who Jesus was for himself. Not just take everybody's word for it. Was it Courtney or Lane? Who raised it? Miss Lane.
Zacchaeus was working real hard to see Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And to be what Jesus wanted him. But Jesus was also seeking Zacchaeus.
Yeah. I think, and that kind of goes back to, I think, what I was alluding to a little bit. Zacchaeus is the same as any other person who needs to know Jesus. So it's not like he's singling him out above everybody else. But here's a good occasion and a good object lesson. And Jesus used object lessons a lot. And, kind of, as Miss Lane is saying, picking out someone who everyone else is back to the you're never happy point I had. They're not going to be happy. How many times was he accused of eating with the sinners and the tax collectors and those things? Because they're not worthy. And boy, there's a good adult lesson for us when we start judging who's worthy and not worthy of hearing the gospel or needing to meet Jesus in this idea. Who else? Anybody else?
I felt like Zacchaeus' desire to go above and beyond, like I'll give 4 times what if I've wronged anybody. A lot of times when we want to make it right, and it's like, well, I'll give you this, but not that, like something that we hold on to. Well, his money obviously was valuable to him, and he was willing to give even that.
So I'll go ahead and get into one of mine here, and Courtney's basically saying the same thing. But what does it mean to count the cost? What does it mean to count the cost? If you have your Bible handy there, look at Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, verses 26 through 33. Luke 14, 26 through 33. What does it mean to count the cost? We sing that song, Have You Counted the Cost? And we say that. The preacher preaches it. You have to count the cost. But what does that mean? Look at verses 26 through 33. He talks about this idea Jesus does. If anyone comes after me, what about family? The question there is, what are you willing to give up? That's the question. I mean, as Courtney said it, what are you willing to give up to follow Jesus? And Courtney's point is, for us, a lot of times there's some categories, or at least 2 categories. Oh, look, Jesus, here's the 25 easy things I'm willing to give up. But here's what I'm going to hold on to real tight. For some people, it is their money, especially, okay, let me just say this. What about if it's what we would call ill-gotten gain, right? What if somebody is selling something that they shouldn't be selling? Someone who's in that business of selling alcohol or something. And look, I'm not talking about underhanded. I'm not talking about outside of legal means. I'm talking about that's their business. You think you could convert someone who runs a liquor store? Well, most of us would say, well, probably not. And why would we say that? Well, because then they're going to have to stop their business. They're going to completely change their life. And kind of back to this other point, maybe that's not fair of us. They still need to hear the gospel. But boy, somebody might say, well, I'm willing to start coming to church every Sunday. I'll do it. But I don't think I can give up my business. And now, a liquor store may be an easy thing to pick out. What else might it be that's, ill-gotten gain or whatever? There could be a list there. course, one of the most difficult ones that we sometimes deal with is, what about a marriage, a relationship? You know, is somebody willing to count the cost and lead that? So in Luke 14:26 there, Jesus talks about relationships, not necessarily marriage, but children, father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, all these things. You know, and he goes on down, and this is the place where he talks about that. Verse 28, for which of you intending to build a tower does not sit down first and count the cost? Amen. Preach it. We got it. But boy, we struggle with that. What's the change that Zacchaeus is going to have to go through? I mean, restoring fourfold is great. I give half my goods. That's great. But what is the true repentance that he's going to have to go through? Or look at Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9, verses 57 through 62. I don't know if I preached this here. I do pretty good most of the time trying to remember. But I've done this lesson before, and I just can't remember if I've used it last year when I was kind of doing some certain lessons that I'd done before. But Luke chapter 9, verses 57 through 62, this is some good homework for you. Go home and read that today and think about 3 different occasions where somebody says, I will follow. Jesus says, I don't think you're ready. I don't think you understand what you're saying, because you've got to count the cost. So, you know, what did Zacchaeus give up? For us, for many people, let me say it this way. What did you have to give up? For a lot of us in the room, we might have been 13 years old, 14, 15. Were you at Bible camp? For a lot of us, we didn't have to give up very much. I mean, we weren't living a sin-filled life. So those things still come up, because you come to a point in your life where you've got to make a decision. I got to count the cost. Am I willing to give that up for following after Christ? And it's tough, but a lot of us didn't have to give that up. Try to put yourself, and some of you were adults. I mean, I'm not trying to get everybody to give their situation here, but some of you were later in life, and you had to make a change and stop and truly repent, truly change your mind, and then change your actions. So here's the song. The song that we sometimes sing, and it was in the material here, is If You're Happy and You Know It, right? If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. We all know that one. Somebody had rewritten the words to the tune, and in the kids' material was a much powerful lesson than I think the kids are ready for. If you're sorry and you know it, talk to God. If you're sorry and you know it, talk to God. If you're sorry and you know it, then your life will truly show it. It's a pretty tough lesson there. We're sorry sometimes, but we're not willing to change. Our life does not show that we're sorry. Now, that's a kid thing sometimes, right, too? You know, they say they're sorry, they won't hit their brother again, or, they won't do this, but then they do it again because they're kids and they're still trying to learn about life. If you're sorry and you know it, talk to God, but if you're sorry and you know it, then your life will surely show it. That steps on our toes. If you're sorry and you know it, if you're forgiven and you know it, there was another verse or a line, if you're forgiven and you know it, then your life will surely show it. Did Zacchaeus' life do that? We don't know. Another instance of where we kind of lose track of Zacchaeus, and we don't know if he followed Jesus on into Jerusalem. Zacchaeus could have been there every step of the way to the cross. We don't know for sure. But if you're sorry and you know it, restoring fourfold is great, but your life will surely show it. One other thing that I had here real quick, we're going to run down to just our last couple of minutes. Anyone can change, right? Who would you put in the tax collector's position? A politician, president, vice president, senator, representative? Anyone can change. How we pray, we often pray and long for our government, somebody, and we say, man, if the president was just a member of the church, Lord's church, a Christian, how great that would be. It would be in a sense. But anyone can change. Do you believe that? Look, I know, and I'm being not exactly facetious here, but we get frustrated with the politicians, and we get frustrated with people, but do you believe anyone can change? Kind of back to this idea, and we mentioned some of the lessons here, but we sometimes become the judge. They're not worth our time. They're too low down. They're not going to do it. They're not willing. And that's not right. That's an adult lesson here that there are other people, and anybody can change, including a lowly tax collector and their time, and fill in the blank with whatever you want to here. We've already mentioned some of the others that were in the kids. Of course, don't steal, be honest. That was to the kids, but obviously a lesson that still goes for adults. So today, do whatever it takes to see Jesus. Seek and you will find. Some of these things that we've already touched on just a little bit. But it's kind of a kid story. We make it a kid story. There's a lot there as well. So Zacchaeus, something to think about and hopefully be challenged with as well. Appreciate your good attention and comments this morning. We'll pick up there then next week.